Imagine it's the winter of 1932.
Right, a really bleak time.
Yeah. A quarter of the entire country is just completely out of work. Banks are locking their doors, evaporating people's life savings literally overnight.
Just poof, gone.
Exactly. And soon, the federal government is going to step in and explicitly pay farmers to, like, destroy their own crops and slaughter their livestock.
Which is wild.
Right, all while people are literally starving in the streets of major cities. Welcome to the staggering paradox of 1933.
It really was a paradox.
So if you're listening to this right now, I know exactly why you're here. You have a massive Unit 10 test coming up on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, and World War II.
Covering those incredibly turbulent years from 1933 to 1945.
Yeah, and we have a stack of your sources right in front of us, your class notes, the lecture recordings, and textbook excerpts.
That's a lot of material.
It is. But the mission of this deep dive is to synthesize this massive chaotic era into, clear, memorable narrative threads so you can walk into that exam room and just absolutely crush it.
We're going to decode the famous alphabet soup of the New Deal for sure.
Definitely. And understand the fierce political backlash FDR faced, plus trace America's incredibly reluctant drag from isolationism into a global war.
And, of course, explore the tense war conferences that essentially drew the map of the modern world.
Right. So to understand the radical solutions Roosevelt proposed, we really first have to understand the sheer desperation of his inauguration.
Oh, yeah. I mean, by the time FDR took the oath of office, that winter of 1932 to 33 had just broken the country's spirit.
People were completely demoralized.
Totally. Unemployment wasn't just a statistic anymore. It was an existential crisis. People had fundamentally lost faith in the American capitalist system.
Yeah, and that profound psychological and financial paralysis is what sets the stage for FDR's unprecedented first 100 days in office.
Right, because FDR couldn't just blindly throw money at the Great Depression. He needed a structured approach to stabilize things.
So his administration categorized their goals into three main buckets, right? Relief, recovery, and reform.
Exactly, the 3 Rs.
I actually like to think of this as like medical triage in an emergency room.
Well, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, so let's say a patient is brought in after a catastrophic accident. The immediate goal is the tourniquet, right? Stopping the bleeding. That's relief.
Makes sense.
Then comes the physical therapy. That's recovery. You have to rebuild the atrophied muscles to get the patient walking again, which, in economic terms means getting people back to work.
Right, creating jobs.
And finally, you have the lifestyle change. Diet, exercise, stress management, that's reform. You change the underlying habits of the system so the patient never suffers a catastrophic heart attack like this again.
I love that analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's categorize this alphabet soup of federal agencies using that triage model, starting with the tourniquet, which is relief.
Right, stopping the bleeding.
So the biggest agency here was FARA. That's the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. FARA basically bypassed traditional bureaucracy and gave direct cash aid to states to distribute to the unemployed.
Just giving people cash.
Just handing out cash. Because the mechanism here is crucial. The goal wasn't to build like a permanent welfare state. The goal was to instantly inject liquidity into the system.
Because if you give a starving family cash, they're going to spend it immediately.
Exactly. They buy groceries, which pays the grocer, who then buys a new pair of shoes, which pays the cobbler. It forces money to just start circulating again.
Okay, so the bleeding stops. FARA does its job. Then we move to recovery, the physical therapy.
Right. And the government realizes that just handing out cash isn't sustainable long term. So they essentially become the primary employer for millions of Americans.
And the anchor of this effort is the WPA, right? The Works Progress Administration.
Yeah, the WPA. The government directly hired millions of people to build the physical infrastructure.
And for you listening locally, your notes actually specifically mention East Bakersfield High School and the Father Garces statue at the traffic circle.
Oh, wow. Right in their backyard.
Yeah. Those were WPA projects. They constructed bridges, post offices, roads. They even hired artists and writers to document history and paint murals.
Because the economic logic was simple. Put a paycheck in someone's hand through public service, and they become a consumer again.
And then you have the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Right. This one was targeted specifically at young men, mostly ages 14 to 24. They were put to work in rural areas doing environmental conservation.
Like planting trees and building national park trails, right?
Exactly. But there's a very specific psychological and economic catch to how they were paid.
What was the catch?
So they earned $30 a month. but the government mandated that $25 of that had to be sent directly back home to their families.
Wait, so the young men kept just $5 for themselves?
Yep, just $5. This served a dual purpose. It provided a vital lifeline to struggling families back in the cities, but it also took hundreds of thousands of unemployed, restless young men off the city streets.
Giving them a regimented, productive purpose out in the woods.
Exactly.
We also see recovery tackle entire geographic regions, right? With the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Yeah, the TVA was massive. They built a huge network of dams to harness the Tennessee River, which brought hydroelectric power to the deeply impoverished rural South.
And think about the economic ripple effect of the TVA. Before this, these communities were largely disconnected from the modern economy.
Totally off the grid.
Right. But once you electrify a region, those households suddenly need to buy washing machines, electric irons, radios.
So you are instantly creating a brand new market of consumers, which then stimulates the manufacturing factories up in the north to produce those goods.
It's all connected. But then we get to the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and this is the one that just completely breaks my brain.
It's definitely controversial.
I mean, people in the cities are standing in bread lines, literally starving, and the government's official policy is to pay farmers to literally plow under their crops and slaughter millions of baby pigs.
That sounds insane.
How does destroying food during a depression make any economic sense?
Well, it sounds like madness until you look at the underlying mechanics of the agricultural crisis.
Okay, walk me through it.
So, during World War I, American farmers borrowed heavily to buy new mechanized equipment so they could feed the whole world.
Because Europe's farms were basically war zones.
Right. But when the war ended, global demand plummeted. But the farmers were still stuck with all that debt. So to pay the bank, they tried to grow even more crops.
Oh, so they flooded their own market.
Exactly. This massive overproduction caused the price of wheat and corn to absolutely crash. It got to the point where it cost more to harvest the food than it was actually worth.
So the AAA steps in to artificially induce scarcity.
Because the only way to save the agricultural sector from total bankruptcy was to drive the prices back up. And the only way to do that in a flooded market is to drastically reduce the supply.
Right. So the government had to incentivize farmers to stop producing. It was brutal, but it effectively stabilized commodity prices so farmers could avoid foreclosure.
Yeah, it was a drastic measure for a drastic time.
Which brings us to the final bucket, reform. The lifestyle changes so this never happens again.
And we see this with institutions that are actually still the bedrock of our financial system today, like the FDIC.
The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Right. It was created to insure private bank deposits. Initially, it guaranteed your money up to $2,500.
Which stopped the bank runs.
Exactly. If people believe the federal government guarantees their savings, they start panicking and withdrawing all their cash at the first sign of trouble.
And then there's the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which becomes the watchdog of the stock market.
It required companies to publish accurate financial reports. That way, investors aren't just blindly throwing money at phantom companies, which, was a massive driver of the 1929 crash.
Right. But none of this unprecedented federal intervention works without public buy-in. And the historical documents in your notes highlight this perfectly.
Oh, definitely. Like FDR's first inaugural address.
Yeah, where he delivers the legendary line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He was acting as the nation's psychologist, demanding that Americans break their paralysis.
He needed them to embrace bold, persistent experimentation.
And you can see the ground-level impact of that psychological shift in the Terry Bennett Clipper interview from your notes.
Yeah, that interview gives a raw, local perspective on how vital these WPA and CCC jobs were.
Not just for the cash, but for, restoring a sense of personal dignity to everyday people.
However, fixing the economy did not unite the country. The sheer scale of FDR's intervention sparked ferocious political battles from both ends of the political spectrum.
So your notes highlight the critics. Let's start from the left. The prevailing criticism there was that FDR was entirely too conservative.
Right. They felt he was just applying Band-Aids to a broken capitalist system instead of fundamentally redistributing wealth.
Who's a good example of that?
A prime example is Dr. Francis Townsend. He argued the New Deal completely abandoned the elderly. I mean, they couldn't exactly go out and lay bricks for the WPA.
That's true. So what was his solution?
Townsend proposed a national pension, $200 a month for every American over 65. The economic mechanism behind this was the velocity of money.
Meaning how fast money changes hands.
Right. The catch to his plan was that retirees had to spend the entire $200 within 30 days. The idea was to force a massive, continuous churn of cash through the economy.
Stimulating demand month after month, and even further to the left was Senator Huey Long of Louisiana.
Oh, yeah. The Share Our Wealth plan.
Right. He looked at the extreme concentration of wealth in America and proposed a 100% tax on personal fortunes over a certain limit.
He literally wanted to liquidate the assets of the ultra-rich and redistribute them directly to families. He promised a guaranteed income, a home, and a free college education for everyone.
So that's the left, but the backlash from the right was equally severe, just for the exact opposite reasons.
Business leaders and conservatives looked at the alphabet soup of agencies and saw the death of private enterprise.
They feared FDR was building a centralized socialist state.
And they found a powerful ally in the Supreme Court. The court actually began striking down key New Deal programs, like the AAA.
Because they ruled that the federal government had unconstitutionally overreached into local economic matters.
Right. So FDR realizes he is surrounded, and he adapts.
To neutralize the critics on his left, he pushes through the Social Security Act,
Oh.
which directly co-opts Townsend's movement by establishing a permanent safety net for the elderly and disabled.
And he also raises taxes on the wealthiest Americans, taking the wind out of Huey Long's sails.
But his response to the Supreme Court on his right, this is where I get hung up, the court packing plan.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
He proposes adding a new Supreme Court justice for every current justice over the age of 70. This could have expanded the court to 15 justices.
Which is a huge jump.
Right. If the court is striking down his policies, wasn't adding sympathetic judges just a savvy, if aggressive, political move?
Well, FDR certainly thought so. But it catastrophically misjudged the American public's reverence for the Constitution.
Even his supporters were against it.
Even his most loyal supporters in Congress recoiled. The separation of powers is sacred. By trying to pack the court with yes men, FDR looked entirely dictatorial.
As if he were trying to shatter the independence of the judicial branch just to get his way.
Exactly. He suffered a massive, humiliating defeat and had to abandon the plan entirely.
And he makes another severe miscalculation in 1937. Looking at improving economic indicators, FDR decides the patient is cured.
Oh, this is a bad move.
He slashes federal spending on programs like the WPA to try and balance the federal budget.
Basically, he threw away the crutches while the patient's legs were still weak.
And what happened?
The economy immediately nosedived into what became known as the Roosevelt Recession or the Double-Dip Depression. Unemployment spiked right back up.
Proving that the recovery was still entirely dependent on the artificial life support of government spending.
Yeah. But despite the court-packing disaster in the 1937 recession, FDR maintains a massive grip on American politics.
Because he completely redraws the electoral map. He builds what's known as the Roosevelt Coalition.
Right. He brings together union workers, intellectuals, Catholics, and Jews.
And crucially, we see a massive shift among African-American voters, right?
Yes, historically they voted Republican, as party of Lincoln. But they migrated to the Democratic Party after feeling completely abandoned by Herbert Hoover's inaction during the early years of the Depression.
Okay, so FDR has just spent years micromanaging domestic crop prices and battling the Supreme Court to save American capitalism.
But while America has its head down focusing inward, the rest of the globe is quietly catching fire. Fascism is expanding rapidly in Europe and Asia.
And the American public wants absolutely nothing to do with it.
Nothing at all.
The trauma of World War I is still fresh. The mood of the country is strictly isolationist. Lock the doors, close the blinds, let the rest of the world burn.
And tracing this timeline from strict isolationism to total intervention is a major focus for your test.
So let's trace it. Where does it start?
It really begins with the Nye Committee in 1934. This was a congressional investigation that concluded the U.S. was dragged into World War I, not by a noble desire to defend democracy.
But by merchants of death, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
American weapons manufacturers and bankers who manipulated the nation into war just to protect their profit margins.
Wow. That definitely deepens the public cynicism.
It did. And Congress then passes the Neutrality Acts of 1935 and 1936, which draw a hard line in the sand.
Making it illegal for Americans to sell weapons or loan money to any nation involved in a war.
But as the Axis powers Germany, Italy, and Japan become more aggressive, FDR realizes that strict neutrality actually favors the aggressors.
Because it prevents the U.S. from helping democracies defend themselves.
Right. So in 1937, he pushes through a loophole. the cash and carry policy.
How does that bypass the Neutrality Act?
It allows the U.S. to sell non-military goods and eventually weapons to nations at war, but with strict conditions.
Hence the cash and the carry.
Exactly. The purchasing nation had to pay entirely in cash up front, meaning no U.S. loans were at risk. And they had to transport the goods on their own ships.
Meaning no American sailors were at risk of being sunk by German U-boats.
It was a way to support allies like Britain while maintaining the illusion of isolation.
But the illusion starts to crack, and the Gallup polls from your documents perfectly track this creeping anxiety.
They show the American public's mood slowly shifting from staunch isolation to a reluctant desire for the Allies to win, even if they still don't want to actually fight.
And FDR leverages this shifting mood. In September 1940, we see the destroyer deal.
Right, where the U.S. trades 50 vintage naval destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on British military bases.
And by March 1941, Britain's completely out of cash. So FDR introduces Lend-Lease.
Yeah, and he uses this famous analogy. He says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose.
You lend them the hose, and they return it after the fire is out.
Exactly. Lend-Lease allowed the U.S. to send massive amounts of military aid to Britain and the Soviet Union without immediate payment. The U.S. had officially become the arsenal of democracy.
FDR makes the moral argument for this shift in his famous For Freedom State of the Union speech.
Telling the public that American security depends on protecting freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, everywhere in the world.
And this ideological commitment culminates in the Atlantic Charter in August 1941.
FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill secretly meet and draft a vision for the post-war world based on self-determination and free trade.
So FDR is essentially pledging America's soul to the Allied cause months before we officially enter the conflict.
But the definitive tipping point arrives on December 7, 1941. The Japanese military directly attacks the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor.
And the isolationist debate just evaporates overnight. The United States declares war.
And the moment the declaration of war is signed, the home front completely transforms.
Because that massive, centralized government machinery, built for the New Deal alphabet soup, it instantly pivots to wage a global war.
The management of the economy becomes total. The OPA, the Office of Price Administration, takes control of the consumer market.
What did they do exactly?
Well, to prevent runaway inflation while the defense industry is pumping billions of dollars into the economy, the OPA sets legal price ceilings on goods.
And they issue ration books for essential items like meat, sugar, coffee, and gasoline.
Right. You couldn't just buy a steak because you had the money. You needed the ration stamps.
The government also needs to manage the flow of information, so the OWI, the Office of War Information, becomes the central agency for wartime propaganda.
They coordinated the messaging on posters, radio broadcasts, and movies to boost morale, encourage the purchase of war bonds, and remind citizens that loose lips sink ships.
And the social fabric of the country undergoes a massive mobilization. Millions of men are shipped overseas, leaving a massive labor vacuum in the defense plants.
So women enter the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. Women are building bombers, welding tanks, and manufacturing munitions.
Women also directly entered the military structure, right?
Yes, through organizations like the WAC, the Women's Army Corps. They recruited women to serve in vital non-combat roles,
like mechanics, radio operators, and air traffic controllers,
which freed up thousands of male soldiers for frontline combat duty.
African Americans also leveraged this desperate need for wartime labor to demand civil rights.
Yeah, labor leader A. Philip Randolph recognized the government couldn't afford a disruption in defense production, so he threatened a massive march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in hiring.
And to prevent a domestic crisis, FDR issued Executive Order 8802. This officially banned discriminatory hiring practices in any defense industry receiving federal contracts.
However, the intense war hysteria and deep-seated racism also led to one of the darkest chapters of the home front, Japanese internment.
Right. Following Pearl Harbor, FDR signs Executive Order 9066.
This authorized the military to designate exclusion zones. Over 100,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent living on the West Coast were forced to abandon their homes, businesses, and lives.
And the vast majority of them were American citizens.
Yes, they were relocated to desolate internment camps surrounded by barbed wire.
And the Supreme Court notoriously upheld this action in the Korematsu v. U.S. decision,
arguing that the civil liberties of these citizens were superseded by military necessity during a time of war.
It is a massive abstract policy, but your notes ground it in a heartbreaking local reality with the blue and white document.
Oh, that document is incredibly moving.
It was a farewell message published by Japanese American students at Bakersfield High School to their classmates as they were being forced onto buses headed for the camps.
It really forces you to look at the human cost behind the executive order.
It does. But eventually, the incredible output of the American home front overwhelms the Axis powers.
And as the Allies push toward military victory, the political battles over the future of the globe begin.
The big three, FDR, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, they have to coordinate a post-war world.
But their alliance is built strictly on the mutual necessity of defeating Hitler. Trust is in very short supply.
So let's briefly trace the breakdown of trust across the three major war conferences. First, Tehran in November 1943.
The primary debate at Tehran was military strategy. Stalin's Soviet army was bearing the absolute brunt of the Nazi war machine in the East, suffering millions of casualties.
So he demanded the U.S. and Britain open a second military front in Western Europe to draw German troops away.
Right, and the delay in launching this invasion planted a deep, festering seed of suspicion in Stalin's mind. He felt the capitalist nations were content to just let the Soviet Union bleed out.
Then we jump to Yalta in February 1945. Victory in Europe is imminent.
The Big Three agreed to establish the United Nations to replace the failed League of Nations. They also agreed to physically split a defeated Germany into 4 distinct occupation zones.
But the most explosive issue at Yalta was Eastern Europe.
Because Stalin's army occupied these nations as they pushed toward Germany. Having suffered 2 devastating invasions from the West in a single generation, Stalin viewed Eastern Europe as a vital geographic buffer zone for Soviet security.
So he had no intention of relinquishing control.
None at all. However, to maintain the alliance, he verbally promised FDR he would allow free democratic elections in those territories after the war.
Which brings us to the final conference, Potsdam, in July 1945. And the vibe here is completely different.
Totally different. FDR has passed away. Harry Truman is now the president.
And while he's at Potsdam, Truman receives secret word that the U.S. military has successfully detonated the first atomic bomb.
Which changes everything. Truman suddenly possesses a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. He no longer needs Soviet help to defeat Japan.
And he uses this newfound leverage to aggressively confront Stalin over his failure to hold those promised free elections in Eastern Europe.
It's like a tense negotiation between 3 business partners.
Yeah.
But suddenly one of the partners rests a loaded gun on the table.
The fragile trust of the wartime alliance completely shatters.
The ideological divide between capitalist democracy and Soviet communism is laid bare, planting the immediate seeds for the Cold War.
Wow. Okay, look at the sheer distance we have covered today.
It's a lot of history.
It really is. We started in the absolute despair of the 1933 economic collapse. We navigated the triage of the New Deal, the direct cash relief of FARA, the massive public works recovery of the WPA and TVA.
The radical agricultural scarcity of the AAA and the systemic reforms of the FDIC and SEC.
We saw FDR outmaneuver Townsend and Long, only to stumble disastrously with his court packing plan.
We tracked the agonizingly slow shift from strict isolationism through cash and carry and Lend-Lease, ending at Pearl Harbor.
We examined the massive home front mobilization of women and minorities juxtaposed against the tragedy of Japanese internment. And we ended in the fractured rooms of Yalta and Potsdam.
You are thoroughly prepared to dominate your Unit 10 test.
You absolutely are. But before you open that exam booklet, I want to leave you with one final historical puzzle to think about. It's a debate historians still argue over today.
Well, this is a good one.
Did the alphabet soup of the New Deal actually cure the Great Depression? Or did it merely act as a temporary life support system, keeping the economy breathing just long enough until World War II forced the ultimate tragic public works project?
A massive global war effort that finally put everyone back to work.
Was it the medicine or was it the war? Keep that question in mind as you look at your test paper. Good luck on the exam. You're going to do great.